I would like to thank Senator Hancock and Assembly Member Ammiano and the Public Safety Committee for holding these hearings. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to participate in what I consider an extraordinarily important undertaking that I think could have national implications as well as big implications for the state of California. In my work with the ACLU over the last 20 years, I have investigated, monitored, and brought class action litigation on conditions of confinement in prison and jail systems around the country. And I have testified as an expert to the Prison Rape Elimination Commission, to the Committee on Safety and Abuse in America's Prisons, to the Citizens Committee on Violence in the Los Angeles City Jails. And I was recently invited by the president of the American Correctional Association to speak at the ACA's National Conference on Solitary Confinement. I've been asked by this committee to give an overview of solitary confinement nationally and recent developments with regard to what other jurisdictions are doing today to address the issue of solitary confinement. It's well known that the U.S. has the largest incarcerated population in the world, with more than 2.2 million people behind bars on any given day, and that we have the world's highest per capita rate of incarceration, too, a rate that's 5 to 10 times higher than other Western democracies like Canada, the UK, Germany, and France. But what is less well known is that the U.S. has more prisoners in solitary confinement than any other nation. It's estimated that on any given day there are 80,000 prisoners in the U.S. held in solitary confinement. Human beings are social animals. Being subjected to prolonged social isolation causes extreme psychic punishment and pain, and especially when that isolation is combined with enforced idleness and sensory deprivation. It causes agonizing psychic pain. And over time, in solitary confinement, those who start out sane often develop mental illness. Those who start out mentally ill are likely to become more seriously ill, and it's well known that a very, very big and significant portion of the prison population in California and nationwide is mentally ill to begin with. Some never recover from the effects of solitary confinement. They go round the bend, so to speak, and irretrievably so, they don't come back. All of this has been known for a very long time. In 1890, the U.S. Supreme Court described the observed effects of solitary confinement like this, quote, "A considerable number of the prisoners in solitary fell after even a short confinement into a semi-fatuous condition from which it was next to impossible to arouse them. Others became violently insane. Others still committed suicide, while those who stood the ordeal better were not generally reformed and in most cases did not recover sufficient mental activity to be of any subsequent service to the community," unquote. Virtually every reputable study of the effects of solitary confinement lasting more than 60 days has found evidence of its negative psychological effects. Prisoners with serious mental illness are particularly at risk, and almost every federal court to consider the issue has ruled that subjecting prisoners with serious mental illness or developmental disabilities to isolation violates the Eighth Amendment. Teenagers, young people, are also at greatly heightened risk. Most suicides in juvenile corrections facilities occur in solitary confinement, and in fact, there is adequate evidence to say that solitary confinement causes suicide. In the California system, the evidence is that 60 to 70% of successful suicides in prison occur in solitary confinement. So with all of this accumulated knowledge, why do we have 80,000 people every day in the United States in solitary confinement? What happened since 1890, or since the mid-19th century when all of this became well known? What happened was that in the mid to late 1990s, there was a mania for so-called supermax prisons, that is, prisons entirely dedicated to long-term solitary confinement. This mania swept the country, and this was at a time of acute public anxiety about crime. Supermax prisons, like draconian sentences and three strikes laws, came into political fashion. It was like a statement that a state was tough on crime. There was a supermax building boom, and by 2006, more than 40 states, as well as the federal government, had at least one supermax prison. In the last few years, though, a national dialogue has opened up, strongly questioning the utility and justifications for solitary confinement. Everyone agrees that some prisoners may need to be physically separated for some period of time to prevent them from hurting others. But even when there is a demonstrable, compelling need, a security need for physical separation, the issue is whether there is ever justification for prolonged and extreme social isolation, sensory deprivation, and enforced idleness. There's a growing body of evidence that solitary confinement does little or nothing to promote public safety or prison safety, and that it's so harsh and so likely to damage people that it should be used as sparingly as possible, only for prisoners who pose a current, active, ongoing, serious threat to the safety of prison staff and other prisoners. It should be used only as a last resort and for as short a time as possible. The evidence that solitary confinement is not only harmful but unnecessary and incredibly costly has given rise to a rapidly expanding nationwide reform movement. The reform movement has been fueled in part by the financial crisis. The states are facing crushing budget deficits, and spending for education, public health care, and other basic social services is being slashed to the bone. A serious national debate has already opened up as to whether the staggeringly high cost of solitary confinement is justifiable. Incarceration is expensive. Solitary confinement is by far the most expensive form of incarceration. The daily per-prisoner cost at the Federal Bureau of Prisons' highest security supermax is $80,000 a year, triple the cost in a non-supermax high-security facility. The per-prisoner cost in Illinois' recently closed TAMS supermax was more than $60,000 per year, triple the state's average per-prisoner cost. Furthermore, there's little or no evidence that solitary actually promotes either public safety or prison safety. A 2006 study on the effect of opening supermax prisons in Arizona, Illinois, and Minnesota found that the supermax either had little or no effect on reducing violence, or that it was actually associated with increased violence. A 2007 study by the Mississippi Department of Corrections showed that violence levels plummeted by 70% of previous levels when the commissioner of the Mississippi Department of Corrections reduced the number of prisoners held in solitary by 85%. That is, the level of violence declined in almost direct proportion to the radical reduction of the solitary. A reduction in the number of prisoners in segregation in Michigan also has resulted in a decline in violence and other misconduct. And furthermore, we cannot forget that prisoners who have been held in solitary confinement have higher recidivism rates than comparable prisoners who were not held in solitary. I want to talk to you about Mississippi, which it's the reddest of the red states, and Mississippi was the unlikely trailblazer in radically reducing the use of solitary confinement. In 2004, the ACLU won a lawsuit challenging the horrific conditions on Mississippi's death row, which was situated in a corner of Mississippi's Supermax unit, a 1,000-bed facility known as Unit 32. Mississippi has a prison population of about 20,000. 1,000 of that was in Supermax. Mississippi's commissioner had long insisted that solitary confinement was necessary for these 1,000 men because they were the worst of the worst, violent gang members, and there was no other way to keep the prison and the public safe. But in 2007, after further litigation, something quite remarkable happened. Mississippi's commissioner agreed to work with a national classification expert from the NIC and an arm of the Department of Justice that offers technical support to state prison systems. And together with the ACLU's mental health expert and with this nationally expert classification expert, the prison officials sat down with the deputy commissioner, with the head of the prisoner's classification team, with the prison's mental health team. They sat down, and over the course of a few weeks, they individually considered every single one of those 1,000 cases. They applied evidence-based risk assessment tools, which the NIC has developed and which have been tested many times. Applying these evidence-based risk assessment tools and factors, they decided, after careful review, the Mississippi officials, that at least 85% of these 1,000 men in the Supermax did not need to be isolated. They should not be isolated. Hundreds of them had serious mental health problems and needed to be diverted to a facility where they could get intensive mental health treatment. Hundreds more were in solitary merely because they were members of gangs, or simply because they had violated many rules. They had a history of many rule infractions, many of these in reaction to intolerably harsh conditions, some of them acting out because they had behavioral problems. But at any event, these men were not actually so dangerous to others as to need to be kept in solitary confinement. Within a matter of months, the department had actually reduced its Supermax population by 85%, from 1,000 men to 150. And the result of this reduction was equally dramatic. The level of violence in the prison plummeted to a small fraction of its former level. And these figures were later documented in a study that was done by the Deputy Commissioner of Corrections and the NIC and the other people involved in this experiment. I will never forget visiting Unit 32 in November 2007 and witnessing the transformation of a prison. I could hardly believe my eyes. This vast prison yard that had always been so silent and empty was now filled with hundreds of men peacefully playing basketball together in a newly created basketball courts, walking together to classes in a classroom that had never existed before, and going to chow hall in a chow hall that had never existed before because they had never left their cells. This was a successful experiment. 3 years later, in 2010, the Mississippi Department of Corrections permanently shuttered Unit 32 and reduced the number of prisoners in solitary confinement throughout the state to a small fraction of what it had been. The state, in the process, saved millions in operating costs, and that's a big deal in Mississippi, which is one of the very poorest states. Mississippi's Corrections Commissioner Christopher Epps has used that experience to become a national spokesperson against the overuse of solitary confinement. And as the current president of the American Corrections Association, Commissioner Epps has encouraged corrections officials nationwide to embrace reform. Other states have followed in Mississippi's path, including states with some of the largest prison populations in the nation. In 2008, New York passed the SHU Exclusion Act, a law that diverts prisoners with serious mental illness away from isolation and into mental health treatment units. In 2010, the Maine Department of Corrections, Maine had exceedingly harsh isolation practices. Maine reversed course voluntarily and made isolation a last resort rather than a default practice. And over the course of 18 months, the state reduced its solitary confinement population by 50%. At the end of 2012, the trend continued. Illinois permanently closed Tams Correctional Center, the state's only supermax prison. In 2013, Colorado closed a 316-bed supermax unit after cutting its solitary population by 1/3. In the last few years, there has been a surge in state legislative activity to limit the use of solitary confinement. In 2013, bills were proposed to limit or ban the use of solitary confinement of juveniles in California, Florida, Montana, Nevada, and Texas. Nevada actually enacted a bill that places restrictions on the isolation of youth in juvenile facilities. A similar bill on juvenile solitary confinement practices was introduced in Texas, and Texas passed a law requiring correctional facilities to review and report on their use of isolation. Maine, Colorado, and New Mexico have each passed bills mandating studies on the use, impact, and effectiveness of solitary confinement. And this is an incredibly powerful and important component of addressing the problem, of actually getting the data, because most states simply don't have it yet. A Massachusetts bill would require a hearing within 15 days of placement in segregation, limit segregation to no longer than 6 months except for exceptional circumstances, and provide for access to programming to prisoners in segregation. The federal government has also recently become involved in the movement to limit solitary confinement. In June 2012, the first ever congressional hearing on solitary confinement was held before the State Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Human Rights. In 2013, the U.S. Senate passed the Border Security, Economic Opportunity, and Immigration Modernization Act, which limits the length of solitary confinement to 14 consecutive days. 14. unless the Department of Homeland Security determines that continued placement is justified by extreme disciplinary infraction or is the least restrictive means of protecting the other detainees. The bill also bans the use of solitary for juveniles under 18, severely restricts the use of solitary for those with serious mental illness, and for involuntary protective custody. Also in 2013, something very important happened when the Government Accountability Office, an independent investigative agency of the U.S. Congress, undertook a comprehensive review of the use of solitary confinement by the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The Bureau is the nation's largest prison system, holding about 15,000 people in solitary confinement. In May 2013, the General Accountability Office issued a report finding that the Bureau had never assessed whether solitary confinement has any effect on prison safety, that the Bureau had never assessed the effects of long-term segregation on prisoners, that the Bureau did not adequately monitor segregated housing to ensure that prisoners receive food, out-of-cell exercise, and other necessities. And the BOP agreed to adopt the GAO's recommendations to gather data to assess the impact of long-term segregation on prisoners and to assess the extent to which segregation actually serves the purpose of making prison staff, inmates, and the public safe. Another sign of the times that we are on a wave of reform is that in May 2013, the Department of Justice completed an investigation of solitary confinement in a medium security prison in Pennsylvania and found that Pennsylvania was housing prisoners with serious mental illness and developmental disabilities in solitary confinement, and that this practice violated the inmates' rights not only under the Eighth Amendment, but also under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Justice Department notified the governor of Pennsylvania that the DOC was going to expand its investigation into the use of isolation on prisoners with serious mental illness and intellectual disabilities into other Pennsylvania prisons. Many major national non-governmental organizations are now involved in the challenge to solitary confinement. The National Religious Campaign Against Torture has made solitary reform a priority. In 2010, the American Bar Association revised its standards on treatment of prisoners to recommend strict limits on the use of solitary. In 2012, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry enacted policy opposing solitary confinement of juveniles. And also in 2012, the American Psychiatric Association approved policy opposing the prolonged segregation of people with serious mental illness. And now an effort is underway to amend the American Institute of Architects Code of Ethics to prohibit the design of facilities intended for prolonged solitary confinement. There's been a new focus internationally against solitary. In 2011, the UN Special Rapporteur on Terror called for a ban on solitary confinement lasting longer than 15 days and an absolute ban on solitary confinement for youth and the mentally ill. There were similar recommendations by the Council of Europe's Committee for the Prevention of Torture, similar in 2013 from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and that commission concluded that countries should adopt strong, concrete measures to eliminate the use of prolonged or indefinite isolation under all circumstances, stressing that prolonged or indefinite solitary confinement may never constitute a legitimate instrument in the hands of the state. There is now massive evidence to support the following 6 basic conclusions regarding solitary confinement. First, Solitary confinement is so harsh and damaging that it should be used as sparingly as possible. It shouldn't be the default. It should only be for prisoners who pose a current serious threat to the safety of others, only as a last resort, and for as short a time as possible. Second, even when there's a compelling security need for physical separation, that's no justification for extreme social isolation, sensory deprivation, and enforced idleness. Prisoners requiring long-term physical separation from others should have meaningful access to telephone calls, letters, reading materials, TV, radio, and in-cell programming. And they should have access to confidential counseling with mental health clinicians, not cell front, but confidential. They should recreate alongside of other prisoners, even if they have to be confined to separate adjacent exercise yards. Third, a prisoner shouldn't be placed or kept in segregation without an individualized determination that physical separation is actually currently necessary for the safety of others. And that means real, meaningful due process and a real, meaningful review by classification team, mental health people working together to do regular periodic reviews. Prisoners shouldn't be subjected to segregation merely because they are on death row, or merely because they have a life sentence, or just because they are gang members. It is a question of whether their conduct, their actual conduct in prison, creates an ongoing serious threat to safety. Fourth, juveniles should never be kept in solitary confinement. Solitary is damaging and dangerous for juveniles. Fifth, prisoners with serious mental illness or developmental disability should never be housed in solitary. They need to be in a therapeutic environment where they can get treatment. Mental health housing can be secure without socially isolating people with mental illness. Sixth, and in some way most important, prisoners have to be given the opportunity to earn their way out of solitary confinement through good behavior. Above the gate to hell in Dante's Inferno was written, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here," and that should not be the mantra of state prisons. These recommendations aren't far out; they're not fringe. This is now the new. You're going to be seeing that this is the new mainstream, and California, we hope, will not be bringing up the rear, but will take its place in the vanguard of adopting these recommendations and finding a roadmap toward the goal of limiting the cruel practice of solitary confinement to the least possible use.
Thank you.
I'm loath to, refer to Mississippi, but what can you do? Are there other jurisdictions where there's best practices, that California could adopt? Because we're looking towards maybe legislation coming out.
I think you should look at Maine. It's a small state. Mississippi is a more dramatic example because there was such a large population, and there's a huge gang problem in Mississippi prisons. So, but Maine, I think, is certainly a state that you should look at. And again, it's a state that where the Department of Corrections voluntarily adopted reforms, and there have been reports written on that. And I think that would be a very good place to look at.
What would be some alternatives for individuals who are dangerous to themselves? An alternative to solitary confinement. Are there practices that have happened or situations where that's occurred?
Is the question correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's asking the answer to that very good question that comes up all the time when you're talking to members of the public. But what else is there to do with...
Well, if you truly are dangerous to yourself, and
right.
maybe it's not a mental health issue, and others, what would be some of the things?
All right, so let's leave aside mental health, because with mental health,
right.
you should simply accept that isolation, social isolation, is the worst thing for most people with serious mental illness. For the rest, first of all, be sure by regular review and by looking at the right data that the person is in current and ongoing danger, such that you have to protect others, that there has to be physical separation. Once you do that, what you need to do is to provide conditions that allow that person to have a life instead of going around the bend from total sensory deprivation, monotony, and isolation. There should be ways to be able to have congregate activities with others, and it depends on the individual, but my goodness, I've seen situations where they have people who are considered the worst of the worst, but they're playing checkers together, but they're shackled to the floor. They're playing games. They are able to talk to each other. Sometimes people can be on the yard together, for example, in parallel yards, so that they can communicate with each other. There should be, as much as possible, things to think about and things to accomplish rather than just having a dead brain by being alone with nobody to talk to, nothing to see. So you have to enhance those opportunities, and then you have to be willing to re-examine this individual's progress. He might not be the same person in 5 years that he was when he did something terrible that made him seem like a danger to others. You then can incrementally increase the amount of freedom, the amount of possibility for socializing with others. What there really is no justification for is to say that the only way to be safe is to put this person in a blank room with a steel door, in a room that is the size of a small bathroom. That is not needed for safety.
I mean, how do you feel? This is rhetorical. 30 years in solitary confinement. Does that happen in other states? And what?
Unfortunately, it does happen. It's extremely rare. We've all heard of the Angola 3. There are a few people around the country who are in solitary for decades.
California's 500.
Yeah, there's still a handful of people like that in Mississippi, but the numbers are always reduced. They are reduced, and it's ideally it should be no one. But I think that what we can say positively is that there's nowhere where it should be in the hundreds, that it just means that there is rote thinking going on. There is not an individualized examination of this person as a human being and taking a look at evidence-based risk factors. When you're seeing these big numbers, there's something terribly wrong. It's extremely, extremely rare. The phenomenon of somebody who really needs to be isolated from other human beings, or from nature for that matter. I just want to underscore how very true that is. In hundreds and hundreds of interviews, I too with prisoners in solitary, to be in a sterile hell where it's not only that you are shut off from other people, that you are shut off from from birdsong, from a blade of grass. That's profoundly dehumanizing, and people don't recover from that.
I steal my colleague's thunder, but I am also concerned about women and in the SHU, and are there different studies around that in terms of the gender issues around solitary confinement, women who are in solitary confinement? Sorry.
That's so rare in other jurisdictions.
It's another California
extremely
outlier.
rare.
I've only ever heard of one or two women in isolation in other states. So it's something people in California are always interested in, but it's not. It hasn't really been studied.
It seems to me that the potential is here. I mean, what I somehow think is possible is that California will go from being the outlier, from being, dragging behind and bringing up the rear, to take a big leap forward and go into the vanguard of there's a developing nationwide movement. There's so much information out there. Having seen that these things can happen very quickly when an individual plays a leadership role and is willing to open up their mind and re-examine these beliefs that they have, that are just like branded in their brain, open it up and, for example, realize, no, people shouldn't be in solitary simply because they're in a gang, that kind of thing. There could be not a slow evolutionary process even here, but there could be it's possible with a hearing like this being a good beginning for there to be rapid change. And there should be, because the problem is so staggering in California. There is no substitute for bringing in independent outside expertise, like from the NIC, to bring a fresh eye to this. I don't know if this is doable or not. If you asked the department if they would be willing to sit down with a member or a couple members of this committee and, for example, take the women prisoners who are in SHU housing and say, let's go over their records. Let's explain to us why. And let's sit down with an independent outside expert and let's review it. Let's see if this is really necessary. I don't know if they would accept an invitation like that, but it could be very enlightening and helpful.
I did just have one final question, which is the answer to the what are the alternatives, which we get asked a lot. And in my reading, there were a number that were mentioned, such as short-term cell confinement in the general population, a kind of, every parent knows, grounding, essentially, or short-term loss of work privileges or program privileges or visitors, but something that would not be as extreme as SHU, and would allow people to earn back the places that they have been. And then the other thing was that was mentioned was better training of correctional officers to diffuse situations within prisons. Again, in much the way that school teachers are now trained to recognize and diffuse potentially violent incidents or bullying incidents in schools. And I wonder if you had any experience with that, and if there were other things that we should be looking at as alternatives. Either one of you.
A couple of years ago, negotiated a consent decree with the Mississippi Department of Corrections concerning...
I don't know if the microphone is on, but you need to pull it closer.
I recently negotiated a consent decree with the Mississippi Department of Corrections concerning their treatment of youth who are sentenced as adults. And in Mississippi, youth from the age of 13 years old on can be, they're convicted as adults and were housed with adults. And as part of that decree, solitary confinement was simply prohibited. It was categorically prohibited. But the sort of things that you suggest, like a brief time out, is an alternative. An alternative is that these are kids who are still getting schooling, so the teacher will come to their cell. They still have the punishment of not being with their classmates, but they're in cell, the person coming to them. In the adult context, when they were getting people out of solitary in the supermax, one important principle that they came up with was that it can't just be sticks. There has to be carrots. Because what the prisoners kept saying was, all we can do is lose the little that we have. And that just throws people into total despair. They came up with a series of rewards, not just punishments, but rewards that people could achieve by being infraction-free. One of those, for example, and this is an extremely poor state, was these little MP3 players. And a prisoner who has been in, this is a guy who has a really, really bad escape from a maximum security facility, and he has been in solitary, one of the few in Mississippi, for decades. For like 3 decades or something. And he said, what an unbelievable difference that makes to have music. So the department actually gives them something, a special meal, an additional visits from the family, not just once a week, but hey, you can have an extra visit this week. You can have an extra telephone call with your family. So there's all sorts of small rewards that in the context of prison are hugely meaningful, and you can use that system as an alternative to simply cutting everything off to control behavior.
Thank you.